who is senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's former editor of City Journal, which, by the way, is a great magazine. If you're interested at all in what is going on in our urban areas, City Journal has got some of the best writing and some of the best insight around for that. Fred is the author of a new book about which we want to discuss with him, The Revolt Against the Masses, How Liberalism Has Undermined the Middle Class. Fred, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me.
All right, now, Fred, this book, a lot of people, I'm 55 years old. I grew up, for the most part, as a young adult in the 70s. I remember all the battles, with Nixon and, McGovern and all those kind of things. And the words conservative and liberal, when I was growing up, and I'm sure even before that, they meant different things, I think, sometimes than they do today. Give our listeners and those watching online just a brief history/civics lesson about what those two words used to mean and what they mean now.
Sure. After World War II, liberalism sobered up. It ceased being utopian. It ceased being authoritarian, and there was an acceptance by liberals of America. And there was a nuance to liberalism. It was open and it was tolerant. And that was the mood of liberalism through the Kennedy assassination. The Kennedy assassination really marks transformation, because the wake of the Kennedy assassination leaves liberals completely bereft, puzzled, confused, and they're never able to come to grips with Lee Harvey Oswald. We just celebrated is the wrong word. We've just observed the first 50 years since the Kennedy assassination. And in the articles about it in the New York Times and the New Yorker, you read that it was the city of Dallas that pulled the trigger. It was Dallas. The liberals to this day have never come to grips with who Lee Harvey Oswald is. And so the breakdown of liberalism as a relatively tolerant set of beliefs begins to break down here in the wake of the Kennedy assassination. It becomes conspiratorial. It becomes infused with the drug culture, and we get the liberalism we have today, which tends to be somewhat authoritarian and unable to have conversations with people. Liberals are people who can't have conversations with people who don't agree with them.
That's true.
You'd understand this if you went on to campus. Conservative also means something very different. Conservative in the 1950s and 1960s tends to mean fusty, backward-looking. It's the 60s, oddly enough, that reinvigorates conservatism, because when liberalism goes off the rails, conservatism is reinvigorated by liberals who leave liberalism and move into conservatism, and that's where we get what's called neoconservatism, which doesn't exist anymore, but which infused conservatism with a kind of coherence and intellectual depth that conservatism didn't always have before the 60s. Now, there are people who disagree with me about this, but this is how I would lay it out.
Mr. Siegel, I want to get to the meat of your book, The Revolt Against the Masses, How Liberalism Has Undermined the Middle Class. And you said Obama and his Democratic colleagues steadily eroded the Main Street middle class. And just my dad the other day is like, I don't know what to do. The lower class people are being saved. The upper class people don't care because they've got so much money, nothing's affecting them anyway. I mean, how can this happen? Because it is the masses. That's the majority of us are in the middle class. I mean, how can this be?
How could it? It's with difficulty. This can be. I mean, I live in New York. I'm speaking to you from Brooklyn. Wall Street is doing fabulously, and the money is simply lapping over to the rest of the city. Wall Street is doing wonderfully. Main Street is doing terribly. You would never know this reading the New York Times or listening to the networks. What we used to call the mainstream media, and I read the New York Times every morning along with the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, et cetera, et cetera. What we used to call the mainstream media no longer exists. The people were so hostile to Bush and so supportive of Obama that what we used to call the mainstream media attached themselves to the Obama campaign. So the fact that Obama has created under Obama, the country's created more part-time than full-time jobs, is something that would have been a scandal under Bush. It's virtually unreported under Obama. So we have a very unusual situation. The country is polarized today. Probably hasn't been this polarized. I can think of two moments in the past on the eve of World War I and during the Civil War. The country is dramatically polarized. You have a left-wing media and you have a right-wing media today. I personally think Fox is the only reliable news on television. It's the only television news I watch as news, as opposed to seeing what their coverage is, what their angle is. Doesn't mean they're always right, but it means that something like the Benghazi attack, it's covered. It's not ignored. Or part-time work is covered. It's not ignored.
We're talking to Fred Siegel, who's senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and is author of the book, The Revolt Against the Masses, How Liberalism Has Undermined the Middle Class. It's kind of stunning to hear, to read something like H.G. Wells' statement that his writings about a bright new future were, quote, designed to undermine and destroy monogamy, faith in God, and respectability, all under the guise of a speculation about motor cars and electric heating. Well, why do some of these people seem to hate what I guess we would call middle class values? I don't know if that's fair, but what is this hatred of monogamy and faith in God and these kinds of things, respectability? What underlies that?
Well, in the case of H.G. Wells, he's a famous philanderer. We all know Wells as the author of The War of the Worlds, The Invisible Man. We think of him as a science fiction writer. But he was an enormous intellectual influence on both sides of the Atlantic. He met with President Teddy Roosevelt. He met with President Theodore Roosevelt. And when he sat with Teddy Roosevelt, he talked about the time machine, and which was a metaphor for class division. And he thought that the middle class, the bourgeois world in European terms, was decadent, that it had to be replaced. And so, and this is a little complicated. Give me just a minute here. Sure. Traditionally, liberals think of themselves as having descended from the progressives, the people at the turn of the century, who were behind Teddy Roosevelt and behind Woodrow Wilson. Progressivism was a bipartisan movement. And they think that we go from progressivism to the New Deal as a continuity, a New Deal to the Great Society. The trouble is, liberalism is a break with progressivism, not administratively, not in terms of the growth of a bureaucratic state, but in attitudes. The people of the middle class loved them. People of the progressive movement were Philo-American. They loved America. They wanted to bring middle class values to the whole country. They wanted uplift for the whole country. World War I was enormously disillusioning for many former progressives who became liberals. They were disillusioned by the war itself, by its failure to achieve what Wilson promised, a world safe for democracy in the wake of World War I. And they were disillusioned because of the repression at home, and there was genuine repression during World War I under Wilson. It was that disillusionment that produces what we think of as liberalism. And what those liberals do is bring to America for the first time a disdain for the bourgeoisie, a disdain for the middle class. That was common in Europe on both the left and the right, but it hadn't been part of America. And there are writers like H.G. Wells, like Sinclair Lewis, some of your listeners will have read, the author of Main Street, and It Can't Happen Here. In the case of Main Street, it's the first book that makes fun of middle-class life. It sees it as soulless, merely conformist, and sees the people in the middle class as zombie-like. That those themes are all familiar with us, because for the next 90 years they become the common currency. So you have this transformation, and this is culturally the liberalism produced by the disillusionment with World War I becomes important first among writers and intellectuals, and then it becomes important in the wider culture. And unfortunately, that's where we are today.
Well, help people understand the whole thing with upper, lower, and middle class, because you're kind of, it's based on pretty much where you're born, right? What's your socioeconomic standing is? I mean, and so most people fit into that category. So to say all these people are bad, I mean, I just don't understand how they would come to that. But I guess they're crazy. You know, when you read what Edward...
Crazy. No, replace the word crazy with snobbish. The whole...
So these are upper class people that feel like that.
Sorry?
The people that feel this way are ones that were upper class.
Or upper middle class.
Okay.
But look, the key thing here is you differentiate yourself. You disassociate yourself with that which is considered ordinary, normal, and you seem or you pretend to elevate yourself. So questions of taste and style become crucial. So somebody, if they have a lot of style, can support terrible. You know, we had Vogue magazine do a spread on a serious first lady a few years ago. It sounds bizarre, but if you have to think about where liberalism comes from. It can't happen here. The quintessential book of modern liberalism, which is written by Sinclair Lewis in the middle of the Depression, is about an American fascism. And the American fascism is born, according to Sinclair Lewis, and hold your onto your hats now, it's born by the Rotary clubs. Fascism comes out of the Rotary clubs. So the idea is that conventional middle-class life contains within it the seeds of repression. Now, what we first get in New York, but you now have in the whole country, thanks to President Obama, is an alliance of the very wealthy and the very poor. The very wealthy, as you say, they don't have to worry about dysfunctional economic policy. They have a direct connection to the government. They're the crony capitalists who've done very well off Obama, or they're the people on Wall Street who've done very well off cheap money. But the rest of the poor have continued to get their subsidies. It's the middle class that can't get loans. It's the middle class whose savings become worthless because their interest rates are so low. It's the middle class who get hit hard by Obamacare that are hurt by what Obama does. Even though Obama talks constantly when he was campaigning about the middle class, but here I have to explain something. There's a terminological question. When he means the middle class, he's talking about the public sector middle class. He's talking about public sector workers. I don't mean that he's saying this as an intentional deception. But that's who he refers to as the middle class, the public sector middle class, which is very different than the private sector middle class. If you're in the private sector, you're a private sector unionist. You care about the well-being of your company. You care about the well-being of the local economy. If you're in the public sector, you have no concern with this. You're merely extractive. So the creation of a large public sector workforce is an enormous consequence in shifting the country to the left and helping to create this top-bottom alliance.
Well, Fred, educate me a little bit. I'm not an economist. How it seems insane to me that you would consider the middle class an enemy and believe that the country could continue down a road in which the middle class is not only burdened more and more and more, but shrinks more and more and more. I mean, who do they really think, for those who are public sector union employees, who do they think is going to be paying for their pensions, and who do they think, the government can't expand infinitely. I mean, do they not know that if the middle class collapses, then the house of cards comes down?
Well, we live in a global economy now. We look at the two places where the middle class is hollowing out most rapidly. We'd look at New York City and state, and we look at California, and they get by just fine, even though the middle class has fled in mass in the millions since 1990 out of New York State and out of California. They get by fine because Silicon Valley is so wealthy due to global sales. Wall Street does well, again, because of the global economy. So the global economy creates the possibility of an enormously wealthy upper class in America with only minimal ties to the American middle class.
All right, so you're saying because of the world economy, I know you're probably not saying the middle class could collapse without any consequences, but you're saying this process could go on for a while without any necessary course correction.
Exactly. If I'm in New York now, I'm going to be in California on Saturday to see my sisters. In California, along the coast, there's tremendous wealth. You go into the interior, and water has been cut off to the richest farmland in America because environmentalists in San Francisco, the Bay Area, insist on it. And it creates enormous poverty in the interior. When I talk to people on the coast about this, people, Hollywood types, they're not aware of it, or say nothing can be done. We have to protect the environment. They have rationales. They have rationales for this. In New York State, if you talk about ways to revive upstate New York, which is Appalachia, which is terribly poor, you're told that, once again, you're talking about ways that it will spoil the environment. We can't have fracking, even though there's fracking and the process of